It's really hard right now because I just get so scared to even open my apartment door and leave my house.
I haven't been able to work, and I don't know if, I'm gonna be okay.
Social isolation is a huge problem for many of the families that we're working with, especially families who are already struggling.
We're dealing with the population that sometimes feels like there's no help available to them, or that they're out there and they're by themselves.
Court is basically canceled for everything but dire emergencies. There are no visits between parents and their children.
If parents are expecting to have a child returned, reunified with them, it's not going to happen.
It's really hard trying to speak to lawyers and caseworkers just to get a communication system open on what's going on with the case.
There's also kids that they're homeless right now, because they don't have that connection to their foster parents, or they leave home because they're being abused.
So the situation that's happening now is extremely important that the youth understand and they know without a doubt that CASA will always have their back and that we're always going to be there.
In normal circumstances, CASA is appointed to the cases of children in foster care when judges are concerned that the child is not getting their needs met by the foster care system.
We get assigned to these families to help advocate for them and protect them.
And as the COVID-19 crisis started to really unfold, our team began figuring out how we were going to pivot to virtual advocacy.
The epicenter is now clearly New York, and by tonight, New York State's 19 million residents will be under a stay-at-home order.
Even with everything that has been going on, we're still able to get things done because the youth still need the services, they still need the help, they still need the resources.
We've been helping families access emergency grants, apply for unemployment and SNAP benefits, helping kids who are in school get laptops and internet access so they can do their online schooling, and making sure that kids who've been kicked out of foster homes or college dorms have safe places to live. And then there's just staying in touch.
How are you?
Good, and yourself? My CASA worker, she reaches out to me just to see how I'm doing, just to see how my baby's doing. That means a lot.
The CASA workers, they're doing what they always do. They call us, they text us, they check in with us.
That necessary advocacy piece has not gone away. If anything, it's just become more important because whether that's substance abuse treatment, mental health, stable housing, these systems that were already hard to access have become that much more difficult in a very short period of time.
COVID doesn't stop any progress. It might slow it down a little bit, but it's not stopping anything.
We're still picking up the phone. We're still getting on the computer.
Conference calls, emails, texts, Skype, smoke signals, horse and pony pigeon, carrier pigeon, whatever I have to do to get in touch with somebody, I'm going to do.
This is the job. This is the job.
What CASA is about is finding creative solutions for families to have their needs met and have their kids' needs met.
That support that we need because nobody's showing up like that. Nobody's there like that.
I never had that type of care before having a CASA volunteer. It's like having a family for the first time, having someone that actually cares about you.
I think that's what matters to us the most. Like, you guys show up and you don't have to show up. So it makes you sentimental because you don't have people that genuinely care like that in your life every day,
Good evening and welcome to the first session of a 5-part #CASA-COVID Fall Speaker Series hosted by the CASA-NYC Associate Board. My name is Sadra Batter-Speaking-Bonita and I am the chair of the Associate Board. We are an organization of nearly 40 young professionals who raise awareness about the child welfare system in New York City, and more specifically, raise awareness and funding for CASA-NYC. CASA-NYC is a nonprofit volunteer-based organization founded nearly 40 years ago. We advocate for the needs of children in foster care and ensure that they are able to transition into safe, permanent, and loving homes. In the case of older youth, we ensure that they have the resources that they need to live independently. Last year, 250 volunteers and a small staff served nearly 1,300 youth in foster care. Now, I would like to introduce you to our benefit chair, Carmen Napier, who has been working tirelessly to put this series together over the last few months. Thank you, Carmen, and we hope you all enjoy.
Thank you, Sadra. The Associate Board is committed to CASA-NYC's mission. In order to continue to support the organization and to ensure everyone's safety, we pivoted our annual summer event to a virtual educational series. The series is composed of 5 sessions featuring expert speakers in timely topics impacting children in foster care. Tonight, we kick off our first session, The History of American Child Welfare. We'll learn about the evolution of the child welfare system and the inequities in the modern day system. We'll also discuss CASA's role in family proceedings. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Your video and mic are disabled, but we do encourage you to chat with us in the chat box below. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation. We encourage you to drop those questions in the Q&A box. Another reminder, we have a very special silent auction with 4 exciting items. The auction ends at 7:15, and the link for the auction is in the same chat box. But we do ask you to hold off on any last-minute bidding until the Q&A. I am delighted to kick off our #CASACOVID speaker series with the History of American Child Welfare, presented by our very own CASA-NYC board member and executive director of the Kenworthy-Swift Foundation, which helps to advance the mental and emotional health of young people by making grants to support innovative programs. Dr. Conroy has served on the CASA board for 30 years and is an expert in child welfare. Without further ado, on behalf of the Associate Board, please welcome Dr. Conroy.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. What I'm talking about tonight is child welfare, or as I say it on the PowerPoint, the welfare of children. Who is to judge and how? This is basically a story. It's a story about the history of child welfare, which started as a course at Columbia University School of Social Work, 15 weeks. That's 30 hours. I condensed the course in order to do 2.5 hours of training for CASA advocates. And now I'm bringing it down to 40 minutes for the Associate Board. I have 2 options. One is to speak very, very, very quickly, or the other is to condense it into some highlights. And given the time that we're living in and what we're going through, it certainly seems appropriate that what we talk about is the way child welfare has, in the United States, become part of the systematic racism that is, in fact, our culture and our problem. So I'm going to give you highlights, and we're going to look at how good intentions for folks affected by their own inability to deal with class, race, and religion ended up providing us with the system that we have now that disenfranchises people on the base, specifically of race and also of class. So if I could have the next slide. Foster care began informally. Foster care was the taking care of other families by families. It was informal family to family arrangements. In fact, there's a story in my own family of my great uncle, who was one of 6 children in Brooklyn. His mother died. His father had to work. His father could not take care of the children. Everyone on the block took in 1 or 2 of the children. They knew who their father was. They knew who their family was, but they were raised by these other families on the block, and they called those people mom and dad. That's the way it used to happen. And as families themselves could not necessarily take in children themselves, help was organized by religion, by national origin, and by race. So there were Jewish organizations that took care of Jewish children, Catholic organizations that took care of Catholic children, Protestant organizations that took care of Protestant children. There were also, and this is totally unidentified, there were African-American organizations that took care of Black children. In fact, the Negro, as the word was used then, Negro Orphan Asylum, was on the Lower East Side in Manhattan, run by African-Americans for African-American children. And the Irish took care of the Irish, and the Poles took care of the Poles, and the Germans took care of the Germans. And so it was organized by religion, by national origin, and by race, and completely undone by the Depression. By the time the Depression happened, starting 1929, you have people in such dire straits that they cannot feed their own children, they cannot feed other children. Organizations that were raising money by religion, national organization, and race, in fact, could not raise the funds that were necessary in order to service those children. And so they did not. This is when government stepped in. Cities stepped in and states stepped in. So it was really local municipalities that provided funds for children to be taken care of in a, quote, professional manner. The orphan trains, which I'm going to talk about later, were the very first mass movement of children out of their families. This was taking children, in this case in New York, from the Lower East Side, most of whom were Irish, and sending them west where there were families that could use, and had space, could use those children, unfortunately for free labor, and in some ways took them in because they actually wanted children and wanted to take care of them. The orphan trains I'll talk about again later. We don't have real federal oversight for foster care until the 1960s. That's kind of hard to understand how it goes so long, but it was done by the state. Adoption was done by the state, marriage was done by the state, foster care was done by the states, more or less well or not well. And so what you have is the feds not stepping in until the 60s, where we have the war on poverty, and we start to look at how the feds could and needed to organize foster care across state lines. Now the next slide. Thanks. We're going to run through these pieces of legislation, and they are the history of child welfare in the United States. But we're going to start actually back in England with the child saving movement. This started in the 1600s, and it was a movement by, as I say, well-intentioned people who wanted to save children from what? From poverty. From poverty. They saw children as victims of poverty. And so what they did was, imagine the town green in an English town. There's the green in the middle, and the people live around it. And the poor people start to congregate on the green. And the people around the green, the park, they don't want to see this. And so they start to collect money among themselves, and they give it to the people who live in the parkland to go someplace else, to go where, frankly, they can't be seen. Never give them so much money that they might be inhibited from working. Never give them so much money that they might be comfortable. Give them just enough, frankly, so they don't starve. That's practically what we have right now in terms of welfare. Just give people enough so that they don't starve. What happened then was that people were not in the green. Other people didn't see them. And there was a backlash to that, where we start the development of some institutions, poorhouses. And poorhouses actually came right from England to the United States. Poorhouse was a place where poor families lived. It also became a dumping ground for all kinds of people that society didn't want to see. And so the poorhouse, the good news was that it did keep families together. Parents were there with their children, but also in the poorhouse were people who were single and poor, people who were mentally ill, people who were lower level offenders in society. We might call them low level criminals, but not so high level that they would have to be sent to prison or something. They were all, pardon the expression, dumped into the poorhouse. From the poorhouses, we developed, and this is all about poverty. From the poorhouses, we developed children going out to work as indentured workers, partly because as children became older, they were more difficult to manage in the poorhouse, and the idea was to get them out. By the way, the poorhouses were started as an entrepreneurial effort. I'll collect money from everybody in the neighborhood. I will start a poorhouse. People will go there. By the way, then you won't have to see them. And a lot of social welfare is about not wanting to see the problem. We don't want to see it. We want to put it someplace else. And so the poorhouse provided that function. Children as young as 8, 9, 10, 11 were sent out to be indentured servants. And the idea was, quote, that they would learn a skill. They may or may not have. We actually don't have any statistics on that. But that's what came from England to the United States, the idea of saving children from poverty. Why? Because it was Puritan. The emphasis was Puritan. Poverty was equated with sin. If you were poor, it's because you sinned. And children were theoretically not sinners because they were too young. And so we will save the children, remember this, from their parents. The origins of foster care are about saving children from their parents. In the United States, in the 1800s, we get to the child rescue movement. Rescuing children from what? What we're rescuing children from, in this case, was child abuse. And the idea was that children needed to be taken away from a parent who was the least bit abusive in any given way. We'll talk later about how most of the children who are removed from their families now are actually removed because of neglect, not because of abuse. The child rescue movement was interesting in terms of never conceptualizing working with parents. If the theory was that parents abuse their children and so we must remove them, why couldn't we take the step to parents abuse their children? Why can't we help the parents stop that? No, it was to take the children away. And that's where we get to the orphan train, which I mentioned on the slide before. This was, again, good intentions kind of run amok. The orphan trains were started by Charles Loring Brace, who was the founder of what is now called the Children's Aid Society, which I want to say is a very good child welfare agency. But its origins go back to the orphan trains. Children on the Lower East Side in New York, and then in other neighborhoods in New York, and also in neighborhoods in Boston, were taken off of the streets, brought to a central place, given a shower or bath, given some clean clothes, and put on a train west. The theory was that the cities were overcrowded, they were evil in a way, they were contaminated, the air quality was awful, poverty was rampant, and here you had the West. The West was underdeveloped, it had people who had lots of land, it had people who were farmers and were doing healthy things. Let's send the children there. That's the surface of it. The problem with removing children from their parents was removing children from their parents. But it was also based on class and race. The children who were removed were overwhelmingly Irish. They were Catholic. It was the time, the 1800s, when Irish were not seen as white. They were seen as other. They were seen as papists. And the best thing we can do to make these children white is send them west and make them Protestant, because the West was Protestant. And so these children who were not orphans, overwhelmingly, these children had at least one parent, and many of these children had two parents. Children were removed, put on trains, and sent west. The Children's Aid Society did send people ahead of time to go into each of the towns. They would use a theater, a church, a community center, and they would invite people to come and select the children. The children were taken on a train from a city, brought to this place in the West, paraded across the stage, and families would choose a child. There's an amazingly good Netflix video on the orphan trains that's about now 30 years old. There are others that are more recent. I suggest this one that was a PBS special because it interviews on it children who were on the orphan train. And at that point, 30 years ago, they were 80 and 90 years of age. Some of them had excellent experiences. Many of them did not. Many of them were really just used for free labor. They became farmhands. They became the value of what they could provide. And there was a lot of abuse that happened and a lot of running away. A lot of children, maybe not trying to get back to New York, but at least trying to get away from the families that they were at that point indentured to. That's the beginning of foster care in the United States. The beginning of foster care is removing children from their parents, giving parents no services whatsoever, and having those children go with strangers. And in this case, really not well supervised and not well authenticated in terms of what those new families did for these children. We're going to come back to child abuse again and again. It is a theme that underlies foster care, but I will say that the larger theme is actually that issue of neglect. So we'll zip ahead to 1911 and we get the first mother's pension law. There were some attempts at mother's pensions after the Civil War. It was only for Union soldiers at that time. 1911's mother's pension law started in Missouri, but it was for the worthy poor. Not every mother was eligible. It was for mothers who had been legally married, whose children were born in wedlock, and who were either widowed or divorced. Abandoned? No. Out of wedlock? No. And white. And white. So the first mother's pension law, which actually was a way of looking at, quite narrowly, a family being able to take care of its own children, was for white women who were worthy, as in had been legally married, had their children in wedlock, and were widowed or divorced, which was quite unusual in those days. It really was for people who had been divorced. Eventually, many other states in the Union picked it up, but again, it was for the worthy poor, and that becomes a signature of many of the quote-unquote social welfare programs. Are you worthy? Are you poor? Are you worthy poor? In 1912, we have the Children's Bureau. This is the very first federal oversight of any child welfare in the country. It's the beginning of the federal government saying, we really need to look at our children. We need to know who they are in terms of their age, their health status, their ability to be in school, all kinds of issues like that. So the Children's Bureau, which by the way, continues to this day to be a whole font of information, a place where you can get lots and lots of information about children and the state of children in this country, it is a source of great information. Let me just stop for a second. Tahui, can you put me on the screen as well and not just the PowerPoint?
Dr. Conroy, you are on the screen. You're side by.
Oh, I am, but I can't see it. Okay. All right. All right, so the Children's Bureau is the very first federal oversight. And if you want to really get depressed, and I'm being slightly facetious, you can go to the Children's Bureau and you can sign up for their monthly email alert. It's very, very good because you can see what kind of programs they fund and what they are looking for in terms of funding. It also lists some of their current research, but it also lists statistics about abuse and neglect, which can become overwhelming. But I would suggest that you look at it. And I think we'll be sending out some resources for you after this presentation so that you can sign up if you want to. 1929 is the Depression. Huge impact on self-help, a huge impact in terms of what I talked before about those mutual aid groups. The Depression just pulled the rug out of everyone trying to use whatever resources they had to help each other, and was really the beginning of organized municipal, as I said before, foster care. It was the end of, it was certainly the end of the orphan, well, no, the orphan trains went on into the 30s. It was the end of ad hoc foster care, more organized foster care, and city and state funding for foster care, and federal money came later. The response to the Depression, and FDR was the president, is the 1935 Social Security Act. It's the most important social welfare act we've ever had in the United States. In fact, every piece of social welfare legislation that has ever been enacted in the United States is an amendment to the Social Security Act. If you were to go on the web, I'm going to suggest you not print out the Social Security Act, because at this point it's probably about 4 or 5 feet of printed out material, because every other piece of legislation was an amendment to it. So I want to say something about the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act was divided into 2 parts. One part was about public assistance, and one part was about insurance. So what comes under insurance? Insurance would be Social Security. You pay in over your work lifetime, and you get money back when you retire. By the way, right now, there are people in Congress talking about Social Security as a benefit. It is not a benefit. It is like a publicly endorsed 401k. You pay into it, and your employer matches, and then you get it back later when you retire. The Social Security Act also included unemployment insurance. Again, you pay in when you work, your employer pays in. If you're unemployed for a while, you get to pull back on unemployment insurance. The other half of the Social Security Act was entitlements, public assistance. You get out because of need, not because you paid in. You get out because you are desperate. We call it welfare. It's been called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Now it's called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Families in Need. It is not based on what you pay in, it's based on need. However, I really want to highlight, remember I talked about the child saving movement and the Puritans and don't give people as much money as they need. We wouldn't want to disincentivize people from working. That's exactly what the public assistance part of the Social Security Act of 1935 did. It keeps the benefit low, extremely low. Why is that? Because predominantly in this nation, we have an attitude about poverty. Maybe it's not as clear and as horrible sounding as the Puritan sin equals poverty, poverty equals sin, work equals salvation. But in implementation, it's just as bad. In implementation, we're saying we're not going to give you enough money so that you're not hungry. So at the end of the month, you don't have to make choices between paying your rent and buying your food. We're going to make you struggle. And if you struggle, then you'll go out and get a job. As if there were jobs that had the kind of benefits that you need and the support that you need, that if you have children, you could have the kind of childcare that's necessary so you could hold a job. So I encourage you to look at the Social Security Act because it is the basis of all benefit after that, insurance versus public assistance. It's not until 1967 that amendments to that act addressed foster care. I think you can imagine that the implementation of foster care was very, very different in very different states. Some states in the union are pretty progressive about benefits for people, and a number are not. In foster care, it was discriminatory in some states of who went in and what kind of care they got. Institutions were overcrowded. Foster care in some states was not even family-based. It was only institutional. There were no services there. It was warehousing. It was warehousing. In other states, there was family foster care, some of it as poorly implemented as what happened to some of the children on the orphan train. In some states, it was better. New York State, which was one of the progressive states, had a 25-year lawsuit called the Wilder case, where children, particularly children of color, were disenfranchised from better care, so that foster care agencies could actually say, we don't have space, can't take you in. And children primarily of color, rather than going into a foster care agency, were sent to a juvenile justice facility, having never done anything to warrant a juvenile justice response. The Wilder case itself, believe it or not, was not settled until the beginning of the 90s. New York had already progressed to do a lot of things that needed to be done, but the case itself was not settled until the 1990s. Another book you might want to read is The Children of Wilder, written by Nina Bernstein, a New York Times author, and really good. It's like an action story to read what happened both to the young girl about whom the case revolves, and also what happened to her. I'm going to zip ahead to 1972, to the NABSW statement on transracial adoption. NABSW is the National Association of Black Social Workers. They were very, very concerned about the number of Black children who were going into white families with absolutely no investigation of were there Black families that would take them in. None, none. I remember when I was teaching at Columbia and my students said, well, you know, so Black children go to white families. If they take care of them, that's good. I said, okay, all right. Let's think about this. And I put on the board, here are the people who are wanting to adopt a child. The first person is white. The next family is Black. The next family is Asian. The next family is Black. The next family is Hispanic. The next family is white. The next family is Asian. So these are the people who are waiting to adopt. Now let's look at the children that come up available for adoption. The first one's white. She goes to a Black family. The next one is African American. He goes to an Asian family. The next one who is Hispanic, he goes to a Black family. The next one is, and so on. And all of a sudden, the students, who were mostly white, were horrified. Were horrified. You wouldn't race match children for adoption? And I said, well, why didn't you have trouble when we said NABSW was making a statement and trying to get legislation passed about not sending every available child for adoption who was Black into a white family? Why do you suddenly have a problem? And the problem was that they were white. The problem was they have privilege. The problem was about racism. The statement was an important one. There was a backlash to it about children having to wait in foster care for a very long time, waiting for a same race family to be available to adopt them. There was not the outreach to Black families. There was not. And one of the reasons, again, goes back to racism. I'll talk about that in a second. I'll come back to that. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, taken up, remember we have the civil rights movements going on in the 60s. We have the NABSW statement on transracial adoption. Now we have the Indian Child Welfare Act. It comes right out of AIM, the American Indian Movement. And you have those tribes saying, wait a second, what you're doing, we are a nation. Our reservations are a nation. We have rights that nations have. And right now you were taking children out of our nation. What you were doing is genocide. Now there's a long history of white American genocide towards Native American peoples. We had schools where we took away their language, their culture, their religion, and then we freed them for adoption. They actually got the legislation passed. The act did pass, and a child who is registered in a tribe, and you can register in a tribe if you are 1/4 Native American, you can register in your tribe. You cannot be adopted outside of American Indian tribes unless there has been an enormous documentation that there is no one available to adopt that child. Do American Indian children get adopted outside of tribes? Yes, they do, but the number is very small. And it's small because the American Indian Child Welfare Act did pass. Up until 1980, when we have kinship care, families that provided foster care, so foster care was provided in 3 kinds of settings: family-based, group homes, residences, and institutions. Institutions had pretty much closed down by the 80s. You still had family foster care, some group homes, and some residences by number, okay? A residence is usually 20 or more. A group home cannot be more than 20. Family foster care was based on strangers. Strangers would approach an agency or be recruited by a child welfare agency to become a foster family. They would be screened, ideally screened, trained, and supervised. Screened, trained, and supervised. In the 1980s, the very, very, very beginning of the 1980s, the end of the 1970s, the number of children in foster care started to decline. One of the reasons it declined was because there was a new commissioner of child welfare in New York City, who himself was African American. I believe he was the first African American commissioner of what was then Special Services for Children, is now called ACS. He said, we're not going to put Black children in foster care. We're not putting them in. We're simply not going to put them in. And we're going to have to provide services and do everything we can to keep them out. And he did. And if the ultimate measure of the success of child welfare is that children don't die, which I have to say is an extreme measure. I would rather think that children were well-housed, well-fed, well-educated, healthy, mentally healthy. But if your extreme measure is that they don't die, well, in fact, there were no more than the annual number of deaths that we have in New York City of child fatality. And then the crack epidemic happened. The crack epidemic tore through poor communities. Children were removed from their parents at a great rate because of this addiction of their parents, and became what were then called border babies. They bordered in hospitals. The hospitals were furious because they had no place to discharge these babies, because there weren't enough foster families, because the number of foster families had declined. The crack epidemic hugely increased the number of children who needed to be fostered, and there were no homes. So, and I have the note on here, this is not based on philosophy. This was based on need. Oh, let's look at other people in that child's family configuration. Maybe there's an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother who can take in this child. Let's make them foster families and place the child with that relative. It should have been based on philosophy. It should have been based on why would you take a child away from any connection that they have in their family? Why would you separate them from anyone in their extended family who wanted to take care of them? It wasn't based on that. It was based purely on need. And by the way, when the need first started, it was, okay, you can take this child in. And they were given virtually no financial support. A lawsuit had to come. It was called Kenneth F. And that lawsuit was one that enabled families to become certified foster families and to get some kinds of benefit. 1997, we have the Adoption Safe Families Act, and this puts an emphasis finally on prevention. Wouldn't it be a great idea to support families to be able to keep their children rather than take the children away? In fact, we have a ton of data that says it's cheaper. It's cheaper to support parents to raise their own children than to take the children out and pay an agency to recruit, supervise, train a foster family to take in a child they don't know. So that's one of the things that the law did in 97. It talked about, it's called ASFA, and it talks about a number of things that are good, but also problematic. One of the things it talked about was a child cannot be in foster care more than 15 months out of the previous 22. Well, that's good. The idea was not to have children wallowing in foster care, not returning to their parents or caretakers, not freeing them for adoption. And we have statistics that show that the older children get, the more they move around from foster family to foster family to foster family. The Adoption Safe Family Act said we're going to put a limit on how long a child can be in foster care. And for some mathematical reason that has little basis in reality, they came up with 15 months out of 22. It sounds like a good idea. I would also point out that the United States is one of the few developing countries that has TPR, which is termination of parental rights. In most other countries, children's rights are never terminated, parental rights are never terminated for the child. We're one of the few developed countries that has that. The problem with this, among others, is that the number one reason why children end up in foster care, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, but the number one reason is that the addiction behavior of one or both of their parents. What do we know about addiction? What we know about addiction is that people who have an addiction issue can, in fact, get out of that situation if they are highly motivated, if they get into a good program, and it takes about 2 years. It takes about 2 years. Highly motivated, good program, 2 years. The Act says 15 months out of any 22. The Act then would enforce termination of parental rights on the average case before any parent could resolve their addiction issues. And I'll talk a little bit more about how children end up in foster care. But it's always interesting how laws start out, again, it's this good intentions and then totally run amok. The good intention was to not have children spending their lives in foster care and have them either adopted or returned to safe families. But if you don't provide the services that are necessary for the safe families, and you temporarily, and you terminate parental rights too soon so that they can be adopted, you haven't really served anyone. I would also point out that most states, New York included, is way out of compliance with the Adoption Safe Families Act. We have not terminated parental rights 15 months out of 22. And the reason for that really is the family court. The family court is so backed up that those rights are not being terminated. And the other issue is that here's a judge who is in the family court, whose heart is in a good place, who wants to see that children are well taken care of. And a parent comes in and says, I flunked out of this addiction program, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to get into it, and I'm going to make it work. And judges give them another chance, and another chance, and another chance. And so we have this situation of family court being overwhelmed, and judges giving chance after chance after chance, we still have children in foster care. Now, we have a lot less children in foster care in New York City than we had before. When I used numbers before, when I said in 1980, we started to have kinship care because we needed to have families, foster families, for the border babies to go into. Foster care was at about 40,000. By 1990, there were 55,000 children in foster care in New York City, just in New York City. As of now, there are a little less than 8,000 children in foster care. Why? And that's because New York was at the forefront of doing a lot of preventive services. So in 2018, actually the feds caught up and they passed a bill called the Families First Act. And this actually says families come first. Before you put a child in foster care, you do something with the family. Before you remove a child from parents, you do something with the parents. That the families come first. And there are good things about the act and not so good things. One of the good things is that the money that is allocated federally, which is then matched by the state and the city, that goes into foster care, can be used for prevention, and it can be used in prevention to purchase other services. So if a family is receiving services from ABC agency, and they are working with a family member who has an addiction problem, they can actually purchase addiction services for that parent. They can purchase mental health services for that parent if they're not able to provide it themselves. So it allows for flexibility in terms of the funds. That's actually a great thing. What's not so great, and is the question that I put on the bottom of the slide, is what is a community? And in that case, they have really caused a problem. They have defined community in huge swaths. So an agency that I've been working with in Brooklyn that used to serve a couple of neighborhoods, specifically Park Slope, South Brooklyn, Park Slope, Gowanus, and Red Hook, now serves from Red Hook to Coney Island. There are 15 different communities along that subway line, 15 different communities. It's much too large an area for them to service and for them to actually get down to do the kind of community development that's necessary, because child abuse is not purely transactional. Child abuse does not just happen in a dyad. It does not happen just with a parent or caretaker abusing a child. That dyad, that abuse, and the person upon whom it's perpetrated occurs within a family, and the family exists within a community. So if you want to affect the dyad where abuse is happening, you need to work on the community, on the family, and on the dyad. If you have a bad cold, you don't just blow your nose, right? You get more sleep, you try to eat better, you try to exercise a little bit, you do some other stuff for your whole body just to try to take care of your cold. It's the same thing. If you want to do something about child abuse, you have to do something about the family in which the child and the parent or the caretaker are nested. We have to do something about the family in terms of the community in which it is nested. And unfortunately, what the 2018 Families First Act does is it breaks down, by enlarging the catchment areas of these various agencies, it breaks down the ability to deal with the community. So I'm going to do the next slide, and that is the reasons for foster care. The three major reasons for children going into foster care are in that hierarchical order. Number one is addiction. It's the addiction, problem, or behavior of one or both of that child's parents. I put up there on the slide that this is actually about access. It's not about the addiction itself. It's also about our response to addiction. our national response to the COVID, I'm sorry, to the to crack versus what it has been to recent addiction is totally different. Crack was about poor families, and the most recent addiction has been about middle class and white families and their addiction. Why have we been so crazed about those families and not about the families back in the 1980s? It has to do with class and race. And in fact, addiction, there are lots of people who are addicted. There are lots of people who are addicted to a lot of things. And as long as they have access to it, it really isn't a problem. What happens is the need to get access to the drug, the alcohol, whatever, that causes other kinds of problems, criminality, all kinds of issues about getting the access. The addiction itself is often not the problem. It's trying to get the access to it. The next issue of children going into foster care is domestic violence. And again, who has access to resources? If you're middle class or you're well off and you are in a domestically violent situation, you can get a lawyer, you can often leave, you probably have a job. You may in fact have a benefit at that job that helps you. If you are poor and you're in a domestic violence situation, you are really locked in. Your only access is to get into one of the shelters which have a waiting list. And this is as if it were that easy to deal with a domestic violence situation. Months, years may go on, while in most cases a woman tries to resolve the situation, tries to protect her children, and then finally gets to the place where nothing's working, I need to get out. But the place of getting out for poor people generally is poor services, meaning not that the domestic violence shelters aren't good, but that they're overcrowded, that they have wait lists, that you can't get in. And the third reason why children go into foster care is the mental illness of one or both of their parents. And again, I have down here Kings County versus Four Winds Hospital. If you're poor, you're going to go to the G building at Kings County. It's overcrowded. They do not have the level of staff that's necessary for all the people that are there. But if you're middle class or upper class, if you have health insurance, you're going to go to Four Winds. It's one of the best mental hospitals in the United States. It's about access. So if you go to Kings County, the kind of services you get, not that those people aren't doing the best they can, statistically is not going to be as beneficial as if you can go to a proprietary or private or voluntary hospital. It's just not. And so again, it's about poor. And the problem with structural racism is that in this country, poor generally means people who are of color. You're much less likely to be poor if you're white. I'm not saying that there aren't poor white people at all. I'm just saying the likelihood of you being poor is much higher if you are Black or Hispanic, much higher. And then the last reason for foster care is the biases in child removal. And way back on my first slide, I said, who makes the judgments? And this has to do with biases in child removal. Who removes based on what? And I have a great CASA example. I did a little workshop with the CASA staff months ago. And one of the workers presented a case that her advocate was dealing with. It was a mother who had 2 children, and the father was not in the picture. The mother had succumbed to addiction. She was not able to take care of her children. Her mother took them in. Her mother became a kinship family. Why? Because she needed the money to be able to support those children. She wasn't receiving the kind of benefits that she needed to be able to take on 2 small children, 3 and 5. She couldn't. And so they went through the approval to get to become a kinship family. Unfortunately, the worker, the public worker, ACS, which is our Administration for Children's Services, In doing an investigation of, we're going to remove the children, oh, grandma will take them, great, they go to grandma, and then investigating the home where grandma is, says, wait a second, you've only got one bedroom. Grandma says, that's fine, I have 2 children in the bedroom, I'm sleeping on the couch in the living room. The worker says you can't do that. You have to have at least 2 bedrooms. We weren't even sure if that meant a bedroom for each child, 3 and 5, one was a boy, one was a girl, or whether it was the 2 children should be in a bedroom and grandma shouldn't be on the couch. But all we know is that the family was told you have to have 2 bedrooms. If they hadn't got involved with the public child welfare system, nobody would have said anything about the children in the bedroom and grandma on the sofa. It was only because they got involved. And then there's this bias about what a home should look like, how many bedrooms there should be, where the children should be. I mentioned before about, you know, Irish children being put on the orphan trains and sent west so that they could live in fresh air on farms. There was a judgment about having so many children in a household. Which is worse? Which is worse? Living in a crowded situation or being removed and going to strangers, because that's what the public worker wanted to do. Remove the children from a loving grandmother because they were crowded, to put them with strangers in a place that's supposedly not crowded. Why would you break down those kinds of connections? Why, when our society is so fractured to begin with, would you break down any connection that anybody has? And so we come at this with bias. You don't speak English? Oh, well, your children, how are your children going to succeed in school if you parents don't speak English? Oh, you eat this kind of food? There's not enough meat in there. Why aren't you doing this? Or, oh, meat's not good for you. Why aren't you doing what I do? I mean, we tend to use ourselves as the measure for what's appropriate. And yet what's appropriate is on a wide continuum, And instead we use ourselves, our class, our race as a biased way that we make judgments about other people. And that has a lot to do with the removal of children. And so now I'm going to go on to the last slide. This is the result of everything that I've said. The children that are currently in New York City foster care. These numbers come from December 31st, 2018. They're still accurate percentage-wise now. Right now, there are a little less than 8,000 children in foster care. Of the little less than 8,000 children in foster care, more than half are African American. More than half. But only a quarter of New York City's population is African American. Latinos and Latinas make up 34%, but they're only 28% of the population. Whites make up 6% of the population in foster care. They're 43% of the New York City population. And Asians make up 6% of the population. Only 2% of their children are in foster care. There are huge problems with this. I actually did a training for a board of directors on this very topic about 7 months ago. And attending the training was the current commissioner of ACS. I want to say at the outset, he's a great guy. He is a great guy. And his heart is in the right place. And when I got to this slide, I turned to him and I said, what percentage of the children currently in foster care are not poor? He took one quick breath and immediately said, no one. No one in foster care is not poor. The reason why African Americans are so overrepresented is because systemic racism has confabulated poverty and race. And so African Americans are more represented. And we put them there out of our bias in doing investigations and making assumptions about those families. So I want to end with a very brief story about the orphan train, because you all are on the associate board, and it's very, very important to me and to everybody else that you stay very connected to CASA, because it is such an important program. So think about the orphan train, and the children are leaving from New York, and they're on the train, and there are some adults with them, and they're going to different cities, and they're paraded across the stage, and different families pick off some of the children. The ones that don't get chosen get back on the train, they go to the next city. Same thing, families in that community take children off, the rest of the children get back on the orphan train. The train goes all the way to East Texas. That's where the New York trains ended. And the children that had not been selected anywhere along the way get back on the train. It comes back to New York. And they go on the next train with the next group of children. Can you imagine the experience for those children? Can you imagine walking across a stage and hoping somebody will pick me? And you get all the way to the last stop and nobody's picked you? And you come back to New York? Those are the children that CASA works with. Those are the children that the advocates stay connected to make sure that they are not alone, that they get the resources that they need, that they are taken care of. That's the mission of CASA. The children who don't get picked, the children who end up on the train coming back. That's the work that CASA does. And that's the work that you do on the associate board when you support the work of advocates, staff, and leadership of CASA. So thank you. I hope this was helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Conroy, for that phenomenal presentation. Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Vella, and I'm the Secretary of the Associate Board here at CASA-NYC, and I will be moderating tonight's Q&A session. With that, I encourage everybody to drop any questions they may have in the Q&A box below if you have not already done so. However, before we get into the Q&A, I would like to remind everyone that the silent auction ends at 7:15 p.m. The link is also in the chat box, and the auction consists of quite a few really great items. So, Dr. Conroy, I'm going to start off tonight's Q&A session with the first question, which I believe now there's a total of 13 questions so far for your purview. And so, in the spirit of our CASA COVID series, can you please elaborate on the state of the foster care system given the pandemic? Are kids being removed from foster care? Are they going home? How has the process changed given the current state of affairs?
What has changed because of COVID has been the operation of the family court. There are a couple of things that have changed. One is the operation of the family court. So I thought you saw in the video that was done at the beginning that the family court is mostly closed and that very few cases are going there. That means that parents are not being heard to have their children returned to them. So there's been a stop. The foster care system has basically stopped in terms of sending children back to their families. That's not good. It means that children are wallowing in foster care longer than they need to. It also means, less importantly, because the numbers are so much smaller, that children are not being taken away from their parents permanently and being freed for adoption. I'm much less concerned about that. I'm much more concerned about the number of children whose cases should be heard and those children should be returned to their families. That's for me is the number one issue. The second issue is from a child protection standpoint, and that is the largest single group of reporters of child abuse or child neglect. Now remember, many more children go into foster care because of neglect than because of abuse. But the number one group reporting is teachers.
Wow.
You know, a distant second would be other professionals, social workers, doctors, dental hygienists, people who are mandated reporters. but they're a distant second. And then after that would be other family members, friends, and anonymous. So the number one group that's reporting child abuse, and let's assume that they're making their reports out of a good intention. They have a child that's coming into school who is completely starving. It clearly is not getting fed at home. Maybe has bruises that can be seen, is not appropriately dressed for the cold. None of these children are being seen. Teachers have not seen children since, what was it, March 18th?
I believe around middle of March, first couple of weeks of March.
Yeah. Children have not been seen by the group of people who make the most reports. Mm-hmm. That's worrisome. It's worrisome on a couple of levels. Are there children who should have been reported so that, not that they could be removed, but so that services could go to their families so that they could get adequate clothing, whatever, food, diapers? Are they getting that service? No, because they're not being seen. And then the other fear is when children return, there will be a flood of reports, just a flood of reports, because all of a sudden those children. So those are the two issues: children not being returned to their parents because of the stop of the family court, and reporting not being done by teachers because they don't see the kids.
Definitely. Okay, thank you for that. And so now I'll hop right into the Q&A box, which we do have quite a few questions. I do apologize to the audience members if we are not able to go through all of them, but in the case that we do, that would be great. So I'll start off now, Dr. Conroy, with an anonymous attendee's question. What are the age groups that child protection services serve, and has it changed over history?
That's a really good question. We have more children in foster care who are younger, let's say under 11, and less children who are over 11, but the children under 11 get out faster, and the ones over 11 stay longer.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting dynamic. Thank you. Next question we'll go to. So, an anonymous attendee again says, orphan trains are new to me. I'm curious, if federal oversight came in so late to the game, then how did kids get moved across state lines?
Mostly they didn't. Mostly children didn't get moved across state lines for foster care. Foster care was done in their city or their state. Federal oversight came late, and unfortunately for some states like New York, which was pretty progressive, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, pretty progressive, the state requirements were less than what we did in the state. But they were good for other states where they raised them up. The movement of children across state lines actually only happens for adoption, which is part of the what's called Interstate Compact Act, and for foster care if the foster family is a kinship care family and they're in another state. Otherwise, children don't move across state lines. And the way children moved across state lines for either kinship care, let's say grandma lived in New Jersey, but the mother who lost her children was in New York, the way that happened was an agreement between New York and New Jersey. All right? And the Interstate Compact, which allows adoption across state line and has allowed adoption across state lines for, I'm going to say 50 years, now applies to all states since the federal action. Before that, the Interstate Compact was any state that wanted to join it. So it often happens that legislation percolates up locally and then the feds make it national.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Lakeisha Roach. Lakeisha asks, during this time discussed, around the 1970s is when this question was asked during the time of your presentation, were there children's rights?
You might ask if there are children's rights now. Basically, no. Basically, no. It wasn't until almost the 80s. Well, all right, let me say, first of all, I'm not exactly sure what exactly you mean by children's rights, but let's say one of the right of a child is to not be hit, right? Okay. Right? We do not have a national law against parents beating their kids. We do not. We do not. There is this gray area between physical discipline and abuse. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I can tell you that that gray area is one that is determined out of people's biases. And what looks to one person like physical discipline looks to another person like abuse, and vice versa. So we do not have a national law, as some countries have, that parents cannot beat their children. And that gray area, this is, please take this with a huge grain of salt, and I hate to say this, but often what Child Protective Service workers use as the determining factor between physical discipline and abuse is whether or not a parent has left marks.
Wow.
So if a child is beaten, but there are no marks, most workers put that into the category of physical discipline. If there are marks, then most workers would bump that up to that's abuse. That is a terrible way to determine if a child is physically abused, whether or not you leave marks. So no, children in this country do not have rights in terms of not being physically abused. They also, we do not have, a lot of people don't know this, we do not have federal legislation that children cannot be hit in school. You're all in New York or New Jersey, right? You're all in New York. New York State has a law against teachers cannot hit children. Not every state has that. One would think that that would be a child's right to not be hit by a teacher. We don't have that. New York also has a law, as do the more progressive states, has a law against children cannot be physically disciplined if they are in a juvenile justice facility, which is basically a junior prison, right? A junior jail. They can't be hit in New York State. That is not true in at least 12 other states in the nation. 12 other states. Children can be physically disciplined, beaten, if they are in a juvenile justice facility, let alone isolation, which, you know, a lot of states are trying to get rid of for everybody, actually exists in at least 12 of the states for children under 18. So no, we don't have a country that allows for children's rights. And by the way, while I'm on it, the United States is one of the few countries that has not signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. So if you're interested, you can Google UN, the Convention on the Rights of Children. The United States has not signed it. And it did not sign it for two reasons. When it came up before the Congress, and it's the Senate that has to approve it, there were two parts that the Senate could not agree with. One was children will not be physically hit. And it included juvenile justice facilities, schools, parents. And the other was that children have a right to choose their own religion. And the definition of youth and child was to 18. And the senators would not allow that. And the president at the time was not allowed to sign it. So we're one of like 3 or 4 countries in the world that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of Children.
Wow, thank you. That's very
depressing, right? This is really depressing.
Extremely, and you know, coincidentally enough, one of the questions that we had lined up for us was how the U.S. Compares itself, or I should say, lines up with other countries in relation to the foster care system and whatnot. So kind of knocked out with, you know, 2 birds with 1 stone with some insight there. And just for the purposes of time, I think because we still have to finalize the silent auction and announce the winners, a last question to be, or more so would be like remarks. If you could please elaborate on your involvement with CASA-NYC, just as closing remarks for the audience. I know it was requested by quite a few people actually. So I know we provided some insight in the beginning of the show, but just to kind of finish it up, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Sure. I didn't know I was on the board for 30 years, but that's what they said when we started. So it has kind of flown by. But 30 years ago, someone who worked for me became the executive director of CASA and asked me to come on the board. There was an opening and she asked me to come on. I was thrilled to be asked because I have spent my entire career in child welfare, either doing child welfare, administrating child welfare, teaching child welfare, and now giving money to child welfare organizations. So my whole background's been child welfare. But what most people don't know is I started in foster care. I was 21 and I started working in an institution that had about 120 children in it. The institution that I was at worked with youth who were ages 14 to 18. When they turned 18, they left. You're going to think I'm like ancient. This was 69, 70, 71, and 72. Okay, long before any of you were born. And I worked in this institution. I had 35 girls that that were in foster care with me. They had all been removed from their families either because of neglect or abuse, and in some cases because they were deemed, in those days, the word was incorrigible, and they ended up with me. I am not a fan of Facebook. I'm really not. But I credit Facebook with the fact that 12 of those 35 girls have found me. This is 50 years later.
Wow.
And I'm in touch with them. And I say that because, you know, foster care can be done well. I happen to be working for Good Shepherd and we did it well. And those girls really appreciated what they got. Most of them went home to their families and we're in touch now. So I don't want to leave you with the idea that foster care has to be horrible. It can be great. It can be great if it's temporary, if it's well-focused, if it gets children back to their families, if it treats them well while they're there, that's all excellent. So I started in foster care and I'm with CASA now as a board member, and I do the 2.5-hour training for the advocates on the history of American child welfare. And by the way, I want to thank you for this opportunity. I am a huge fan of young people getting involved in social issues. And we don't always think of child welfare as a social issue. I think it's about as important as a social issue can get. Because if we don't take care of the young people behind us, and in your case, it's the young people behind you, nobody's going to take care of them. So thank you, every one of you.
Definitely. We appreciate that. And thank you so much for your time. You know, I think we all are trying to leave the world a better place than we found it. So trying to pave a better path for the people behind us, in which case, you know, the associate board can really not thank you enough for not only answering these questions during this Q&A session, but your time and over the years and everything for this institution. And again, to the audience, thank you everybody for tonight's questions and timing in. So now at this time, I'm going to pass it back over to Carmen to announce the silent auction winners. Thank you again to everyone who joined. Thank you again so much to Dr. Conroy. We all really appreciate it and very much enjoyed hearing you speak tonight.
Oh my God.
Hi all. Wow, I have been informed tonight and my mind is blown. I knew this was going to be informative, but thank you so much, Dr. Conroy, and thank you all for joining us. So we're going to pivot a little bit here. It's auction time. Thank you to all who participated. Before I announce the winners of our auction, I wanted to give you all a bit of insight on how this came to be. We designated different teams per session, and each team was delegated to acquire these auction items. So I did want to give a shout out to Team 1 for working so diligently to make this auction happen, and all of the members of the board and the subcommittee. Without you, these would not come to fruition. I also wanted to thank Taylor, who is currently an intern with CASA and is handling all of our slides tonight and helping us navigate this new Zoom world. So thank you so much, Taylor, for your help. A special thanks to Flower School New York, A to Zine Jewelry, Kay Carroll's Designs, and Barry's Boot Camp for generously donating to our cause tonight, especially during such uncertain times. Now, without further ado, the winner of tonight's first item, one beginner's flower arrangement class at Flower School, New York, is, drum roll please, Ollie M. Congratulations, Ollie, on winning. I'm a little bit jealous. All right, moving on. The winner of our second item, a one-of-a-kind vintage necklace, bracelet, and earrings from A to Z Design, is Tiffany O. Congratulations, Tiffany, and thank you so much for participating. I'm also jealous of that. All right, our third item, a fitness 10 class pack with Barry's Boot Camp. The winner is Joanna. Aye, woo! You're gonna get your fit on. Thank you, Joanna. Congratulations. And finally, the winner of our fourth item, a vegan leather handbag, wallet, and passport cover from Kay Carroll Bags, is Tanya R. Tanya, you're going to be walking down the streets of New York in style. Congratulations. And thank you to all of our winners and all who placed bids on these auction items. Your efforts benefit CASA-NYC, and we so appreciate this support. Winners, don't worry, you will receive an email after tonight's program on how to claim your item. Another reminder, we'll have different auction items over the course of the hashtag CASA-COVID series, so make sure to check back in even if you're unable to attend another session, and spread the word to your friends. I would now like to introduce to you a CASA-NYC employee, the fabulous Tukohi Mosoyan, for some final remarks and thanks.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for that lively walkthrough of our silent auction results. And a big congratulations to our winners. A big thanks to everybody for joining us, and especially to Dr. Conroy for sharing her perspective and wealth of experience with us this evening. For those of you whose questions were not answered, we will make sure to get them to Dr. Conroy when we send out our email, our follow-up email with a recording of this video. We are so grateful that you have chosen to spend your night with us in support of CASA-NYC's work. As you know, the child welfare system is highly fragmented and bureaucratic, which makes it extremely difficult to navigate. CASA advocates help to make the system work better so that children can spend less time in foster care and have a better chance at a better future. Please consider making a donation to ensure more children have the undivided attention and support of CASA volunteers during these uncertain times. There is a link in the chat box. A gift in any amount will help us reach more children during this crisis. We hope to see many of you at our next session in our hashtag CASA-COVID speaker series on October 8th, where we will learn about special education from CASA volunteer advocate and Include NYC family educator Diana Biagioli. The registration link will also be in the chat box, and it will remain there for 10 minutes until the session is disconnected. Again, thank you all. Congratulations to our winners, and have a great evening.